The blue lights hit your rear view mirror before you even realize what you did. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel. You check your speed, your mirrors, your memory. Was it the lane change, the turn signal, or nothing at all? The siren chirps once, sharp and impatient, and now there's no doubt. You're being pulled over. Your heart rate climbs just a little, even if you've done nothing wrong. You pull to the side, engine idling, and suddenly the quiet inside your car feels louder than anything outside. You see the officer step out in your side mirror, slow, deliberate, watching you as much as you're watching them. Have you ever been in a traffic stop where something just felt off? Like the officer wasn't being straight with you or was trying to steer the situation in a direction that didn't make sense? If you have, I want you to drop your experience in the comments, because what we're going to walk through today might connect dots you didn't even realize were there. And there's something important about how these interactions actually unfold that most drivers completely miss until it's too late. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Not every traffic stop is clean, and not every officer is playing it straight. And sometimes, the only thing exposing that is a tiny camera clipped to their chest. Let me paint you a scenario that happens more often than people think. You're sitting there, hands visible, trying to do everything right. The officer approaches and gives you the usual line. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" It sounds casual, almost polite, but there's a reason that question is always first. It's not just small talk, it's a test. Most drivers don't realize that this is the first moment where the officer is evaluating you, not just your words, but your tone, your hesitation, your eye movement, even how quickly you respond. If you say, "No, officer," that's one category. If you say, "Maybe I was going a little fast," that's another. If you start rambling, apologizing, or guessing, you've just handed them something to work with. Now imagine this. The officer says you were speeding, let's say 15 over. But you know, without a doubt, you weren't. You were watching your speed. You were maybe even under the limit because traffic was heavy. Here's where things start to feel strange. You politely say, "I don't believe I was speeding," and the officer pauses, just a bit too long. Then they say, "Well, I clocked you." That sounds definitive, right? Almost like the conversation is over. But here's what most people don't understand. That statement, "I clocked you," is often treated like unquestionable fact in the moment. But later, when bodycam footage or dashcam footage is reviewed, things can fall apart quickly if that claim isn't backed up. And this is exactly where some officers make a critical mistake. They assume you won't question it. They assume you won't fight it. They assume the stop will end with a ticket and you'll just move on. But body cameras don't forget, and they don't get nervous, and they don't change their story halfway through a stop. Let's go deeper into how these interactions actually unfold, because this is where the psychology gets interesting. When an officer initiates a stop, they're not just enforcing a law, they're building a narrative. From the moment they hit their lights, they're already thinking ahead. What violation occurred? What's the justification? What indicators might suggest something more serious? And here's where things can get murky. Sometimes, an officer might not have a strong initial reason. Maybe it's a hunch. Maybe it's a minor technicality. Maybe it's something they think they saw but aren't entirely sure about. So what happens next? They start fishing. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Is this your vehicle? Anyone else in the car? These questions aren't random. They're designed to get you talking. Because the more you talk, the more chances there are for inconsistencies, nervousness, or admissions, intentional or not. Now imagine you're calm. You answer briefly. You don't volunteer extra information. You don't try to fill the silence. That silence, it makes a lot of drivers uncomfortable. But it also makes some officers uncomfortable. And that's when the tone can shift. An officer who started out casual might suddenly become more direct, more probing, maybe even a little impatient. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you're not giving them what they expected. Now let's bring bodycam into this. In a situation where an officer claims one thing verbally, like "you were speeding" or "you crossed the line," but the footage doesn't clearly support it, that's where credibility starts to crack. And it doesn't always happen in obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle. The officer might say you were weaving, but the footage shows a steady lane position. They might claim you hesitated unusually long at a stop sign, but the video shows a normal pause. They might say your behavior was suspicious, but your responses are calm and consistent. And here's the part that people rarely think about. Officers know they're being recorded, but they also rely on the fact that most people will never see that footage. That's the gap where problems happen. Let's talk about a moment that escalates more stops than almost anything else: the request to step out of the vehicle. Legally, in many situations, officers can ask you to step out. That part surprises people, but it's been upheld in court decisions. However, the way it's presented can feel like something more serious is happening. Go ahead and step out of the vehicle. There's a pause. Your mind starts racing. Did I do something worse than I thought? Is this turning into an arrest? And here's where small mistakes start stacking up. Some drivers argue immediately, some refuse outright, some step out but start explaining themselves rapidly, trying to control the situation. What they don't realize is that every one of those reactions is being observed and interpreted. An officer might say later, "The driver became argumentative," or "The driver appeared nervous and evasive." Now imagine that statement being compared to bodycam footage. If the footage shows a calm driver asking reasonable questions, that officer's credibility takes a hit. And this is where things get really interesting, because when officers exaggerate or misrepresent small details, it often isn't about a single lie. It's about reinforcing a narrative they've already decided on. Let's say an officer suspects something more, maybe drugs, maybe DUI, maybe just a gut feeling that something isn't right. If they don't have clear evidence, they might start stacking observations. The driver avoided eye contact. The driver's hands were shaking. The driver gave inconsistent answers. Individually, those things might mean nothing. Together, they can be used to justify further action. But when bodycam shows steady eye contact, normal hand movement, and consistent answers, that entire structure starts to collapse. And that's when cases fall apart. Now let's talk about something most drivers don't even realize is happening during a stop. Time. How long you're held matters. Not in a casual sense, but legally. An officer can't extend a stop indefinitely without a valid reason. The purpose of the stop is tied to the original reason. Once that's addressed, anything beyond that needs justification. But here's what happens in real life. An officer might take your license and registration and then disappear for a while. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe longer. When they return, they might start asking unrelated questions, or they might call for backup, or a K9 unit. And if you're not paying attention, it just feels like part of the process. But if the original reason for the stop doesn't support that extended time, it becomes a problem. And once again, bodycam captures everything: the timing, the pauses, the shifts in conversation. It shows whether the officer stayed focused on the reason for the stop or drifted into something else without clear justification. Now let's circle back to the idea of an officer being exposed. When people hear that phrase, they often imagine something dramatic, a clear, undeniable moment where the officer says one thing and the footage shows the opposite. That does happen, but more often it's quieter than that. It's the accumulation of small inconsistencies, a statement that doesn't quite match the video, a justification that feels stretched, a tone that changes when the driver doesn't comply the way the officer expected. And when those moments are reviewed later by a lawyer, a judge, or even the public, they paint a very different picture than what was presented in the moment. Let me give you a practical insight that could change how you handle a stop. Most drivers think their goal is to convince the officer they did nothing wrong. That's a mistake. Your goal is not to argue your case on the roadside. Your goal is to avoid making the situation worse. Because the roadside is not where decisions are finalized. It's where impressions are formed. And impressions can be misleading, especially if someone is trying to steer them. If an officer is mistaken, or worse, if they're not being entirely truthful, the last thing you want to do is give them more material to work with. Stay calm. Keep your answers simple. Don't volunteer information that wasn't asked for. And here's the part people struggle with. Silence is not your enemy. You don't have to fill every pause. You don't have to explain every detail of your day, because every extra word is another opportunity for misinterpretation. Now, I'm not saying every officer is out there trying to manipulate situations. Most are doing their job, and many do it professionally. But the reality is, you don't control which kind of officer you're dealing with. And that uncertainty is exactly why understanding these dynamics matters. Because when a situation turns, it often turns quietly. The tone shifts, the questions change, the stop lasts longer than expected. And by the time you realize something isn't right, you've already said more than you should have. That's why bodycam footage has become such a powerful equalizer. It doesn't just capture what happened, it captures how it happened, the pauses, the interruptions, the exact wording of questions and answers. And sometimes that's all it takes to expose a story that doesn't hold up. So the next time you see those blue lights in your mirror, remember this. The stop isn't just about what you did or didn't do. It's about how the interaction unfolds from that moment forward. And whether or not that story holds up later depends on details most people don't even realize are being recorded.